This video is about a research project that I've been working on with Dave McLeod and Nicole Mideo. I study microbes, like bacteria and viruses, and I'm really interested in how they evolve. One of the main things we're worried about is whether pathogens can evolve against the defenses we have against them, like antibiotics, or in this case, vaccines. Of course, people are working on solutions to that problem right now. One really neat idea is to design a vaccine that targets some part of the pathogen that can't evolve or doesn't evolve. And so in this case, you would always be protected against the pathogen. This would be called a universal vaccine, but we don't have any of those yet. Another idea is to create a kind of cocktail in the vaccine so that it targets all different parts of the pathogen. Then it might be really hard for the pathogen to evolve all those targets simultaneously. The third idea that we're going to explore here is to give different vaccines to different people. This would create kind of a cocktail at the population level. So if we gave out 2 different vaccines to this population, we'd have what we would call a Mosaic vaccination strategy. Now, to understand this Mosaic strategy, first I'll have to back up and explain what I mean by different vaccines. Let's suppose that we zoom in on a particular microbe, say this virus here. It has different proteins on its surface. I've called them protein A and protein B. Now, when a mutation occurs in the virus, it affects only one of these proteins. So here I'll draw a picture imagining that protein A has changed its shape and then wouldn't be recognized by the immune system anymore if we were vaccinated against protein A. Similarly, you could have a different mutation that targets protein B. This wouldn't affect protein A, but now B would change its shape. If we have a vaccine that targets protein A, it would be effective against these 2 versions of this virus. And likewise, if we had a vaccine that was designed to target protein B, it would only be effective against these 2 versions of the virus. We'll imagine for our hypothetical vaccines here that they're completely equivalent. So we take the all else being equal strategy. So in particular, what do I mean by that? I mean that these vaccines, when they are directed against targets that they've been designed for, are equally effective in all people, equally effective as each other, and that mutations are equally likely at both A and B. The question we want to ask is, how will conventional vaccination, in which we give everyone the same vaccine, stack up against Mosaic vaccination? Since I've just said that the vaccines are equally effective and equally likely to be mutated against, maybe it doesn't really matter if we give everyone the same vaccine or if we split it up. And if we did Mosaic vaccination, there's a further question. How do we split it up? Is there some special ratio of A vaccine and B vaccine that will protect the population best? So in brief, how much A and how much B should we give out? Now, since I'm giving this little video, you probably can guess the answer to one of these questions. So, spoiler alert, Mosaic vaccination turns out to be always as good and usually quite a bit better than conventional vaccination. But the other surprising result that we found is that even though the 2 vaccines are equally effective and equally likely to be subject to mutation, there are better strategies than giving them out as 50-50. To understand that, let's look at how an epidemic plays out with conventional vaccination. We've been used to looking at graphs like this, where we look at the number of infected people over time as a first wave and a second wave of an epidemic occurs. But I'm literally going to erase that and instead look at the number of happy, healthy, uninfected people in the population. These are the people that never caught the disease during the whole epidemic. U stands for uninfected. These people might be vaccinated or not. At the start of the epidemic, 100% of these people, are uninfected. When the epidemic starts, some of those people, maybe people who were unvaccinated or maybe people in whom the vaccine was less effective, get infected and the U curve goes down. Then we'll imagine that at some point a mutation occurs in the virus. To look at the worst case scenario, I'm going to imagine that the virus will be able to mutate at A and at B eventually. So whether we've vaccinated against A or B, once a mutation occurs in that protein, the whole population is susceptible to the virus again. The epidemic proceeds and eventually dies out. But why does the epidemic die out before everyone is infected? Imagine that at the beginning of the epidemic, every infected person infects on average 3 new people. We call these people the contacts of the infected person. As the epidemic plays out in this toy population, you can see that as more and more people are already infected, new infections might only infect 2 other people because one of their contacts is already infected, or even 1. So over time, the number of contacts each person makes with someone who is still susceptible goes down. Eventually, everyone infects less than 1 new person and the epidemic dies out. Of course, in this tiny population, everyone got infected, but that's not usually the case. The point at which there are exactly enough uninfected people that everyone infects only 1 or fewer other people is called the herd immunity threshold. I've drawn it here. Now you're probably wondering why the epidemic continued long after the U population crossed that threshold. Imagine that just at this time, when the U population crossed the threshold, we had 100 infected people in the population. They each infect less than 1 new person on average. So there might be 50 new infected people next week, and 25 the week after that. Even though at this point the disease is destined to die out, it still takes a while to get down to 0 cases, and more people are getting infected while this happens. So this distance, the distance between the herd immunity threshold and the point at which the disease actually disappears, is called the overshoot, and that's going to be really important to what we see next. Now that we've figured all of that out, let's have a look at what happens with different vaccination strategies. With conventional vaccination, we just get the picture that we drew before. An initial first wave, then a mutation, a second wave in which a lot of people are susceptible, and quite a lot of overshoot. Now let's compare that with what might happen with Mosaic vaccination. Let's start by looking at a 50-50 strategy. After the first wave, half of the vaccinated people are susceptible, and so we get a smaller second wave. But of course, another mutation might happen, say at target B, and then we get a third wave in this case. But because there are fewer infected people at the point when the population crosses the threshold, the third wave is smaller. Overall, the overshoot is less, and even though both mutations happened, so everyone ended up susceptible to this virus, more people were protected. At this point, somebody, I think it was Dave, had a really smart idea. Dave said, why don't we actually give a little more of the A vaccine and less B? If we did it just right, the first wave would be bigger because when A mutates, more people will be susceptible. But perhaps we could ease the population down so that we just hit the herd immunity threshold. Then we could eliminate the second wave altogether. So let's have a look at what this Mosaic asymmetrical vaccination strategy would look like. The first wave, of course, looks exactly the same. Then when A mutates, more people are susceptible. And so we could just hit the herd immunity threshold if we do it right. Then if B mutates, it doesn't matter because the population's already protected by herd immunity. Of course, we don't know if A will mutate first. If B mutates first, instead we'd get a smaller first wave and then an even more dramatic second wave if A mutates later. We don't know which of these 2 mutations would happen first, but taken over many seasons or many populations, we might expect the average outcome to look something like this. So in summary, Mosaic asymmetrical vaccination is expected to land the population here. You'll remember that conventional vaccination left us with a big overshoot. But even if we don't know exactly how to distribute the vaccine, even Mosaic at 50-50 always does better than conventional, usually substantially better. Now, of course, like any mathematical model, there are a huge number of assumptions and caveats to this work. It's not really very realistic yet, but I think our take-home message is pretty clear. Mosaic vaccination is definitely an idea that's interesting, potentially useful, and worth exploring further.